But fate, or perhaps something older and wilder, had other plans. From the shadows of the forest, a white figure emerged. An albino lion, a creature of legends, observed the scene with an intensity that transcended mere curiosity. Without hesitation, the majestic feline plunged into the icy waters. With surprising strength and instinctive delicacy, it used its teeth to pull the wheelchair back to the bank, keeping the elderly woman safe from the river's deadly embrace. The daughter, who was already preparing to flee in her car, saw the lion approach, not with blind fury, but with a silent determination. With a roar that made the earth tremble and a precise strike of its powerful paw, it crushed the vehicle's bodywork, preventing any attempt to escape. The villain was trapped, not by chains, but by fear and the imposing presence of wild justice. The lion's roar still echoed in the forest, a primordial symphony of power and warning. The car's body, once a symbol of escape and impunity, was now a twisted mass of metal, a silent testament to savage fury. In that instant, Sophia's world collapsed. The shock of the impact reverberated in her chest, but it was the silence that followed that paralyzed her. A heavy silence broken only by the distant murmur of the river and the sound of her own heart beating erratically in her ears. Her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the lion. It was not a zoo creature nor an image in a documentary. It was real, colossal. Its white fur gleaming with an almost supernatural intensity under the filtered light of the trees. Its golden eyes, previously focused on destruction, were now fixed on her, a gaze that seemed to penetrate her soul, unraveling every cruel intention, every selfish thought. Sophia felt a chilling cold run down her spine, far more intense than the damp river breeze. This was no ordinary animal. It was a judge, a four-legged executioner emerged from a nightmare. A few meters away, the wheelchair rested on the bank, her mother still in it, pale and trembling, but alive. The lion, with an almost human dignity, positioned itself between Sophia and the elderly woman, a silent and imposing guardian. The image of her mother, whom she had pushed to certain death, now safe under the protection of a legendary beast, was a cruel mirror of her own depravity. Guilt, a feeling she rarely allowed to surface, began to gnaw at the edges of her consciousness, mixed with the purest dread. Sophia tried to move, but her legs seemed rooted to the ground. The instinct to flee screamed in her mind, but to where? The car was unusable, the forest dense and unknown, and the river, which should have been her accomplice, now seemed an insurmountable abyss. She looked at the lion, searching for a sign, a loophole, anything that would indicate this was just a fortuitous encounter with nature. But the feline's posture was unshakable, its presence an impassable barrier. "No, please." The words came out as a hoarse, almost inaudible whisper. She didn't know if she was pleading with the lion, with fate, or with herself to wake from that nightmare. The creature did not react, only kept its gaze fixed, a silence that was more terrifying than any roar. It was the calm before the storm, justice's pause before its final verdict. An uncontrollable tremor seized her. It wasn't just the cold, but the recognition of her helplessness. She, who had always manipulated, controlled, and discarded, was now at the mercy of a force that transcended her understanding. The inheritance, the motive for her atrocity, seemed so insignificant now, so distant from the brutal reality that surrounded her. The image of the luxurious house, the life of comfort she craved, vanished before the imminent threat. Her mother slowly began to recover from the shock. Her blurred eyes focused on Sophia, then on the lion. A mixture of confusion, terror, and finally a painful understanding took over her aged face. She didn't need words to understand what had happened, or what had almost happened. Her own daughter's betrayal laid bare by the divine intervention of a beast. The lion took a slow, majestic step toward Sophia. It wasn't an aggressive advance, but a deliberate movement, cornering her further against the crumpled car. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to run, but fear held her paralyzed. She smelled the damp earth, the wild scent of the lion, and the cold breath of her own condemnation. The sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and purple hues, but for Sophia, the world was plunging into the deepest darkness. She was trapped, not just physically, but by the web of her own actions, and the albino lion was the herald of a justice she never imagined facing. What would it do? No one knew. But the weight, under the gaze of that mythical creature, was a torment that surpassed any physical pain. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth, wild scrub, and for Sophia, the metallic odor of her own dread. The lion, with a slow, calculated step, did not advance to attack, but to encircle. Every movement of that colossal beast was a silent sentence, an undeniable reminder that she was in its domain, at the mercy of a force that transcended any human law. Sophia's heart pounded like an uncontrolled drum in her chest, echoing in her ears, drowning out the murmur of the river that, moments before, she had hoped would be her mother's tomb. Now, the river seemed to mock her, an accomplice who had refused to fulfill its part in the macabre pact. The lion's golden eyes, previously fixed on her, shifted for an instant to the wheelchair, where her mother, still pale and trembling, observed the scene with a mixture of horror and a strange, almost imperceptible resignation. The lion's gaze at the elderly woman was not that of a predator, but of a protector, a guardian who had emerged from the depths of nature to correct a brutal injustice. For Sophia, it was a blow more painful than any paw strike. The beast judged her, and judged her guilty. No, please. The words returned, a thread of a voice that barely scraped her dry throat. She didn't know what she was asking for or from whom. It was a lament, a desperate plea for a mercy she herself had never offered. The lion, however, was not a creature of pleas. It was the very manifestation of consequence, of savage retribution. Its silence was deafening, more terrifying than any roar, for it left Sophia's mind free to fill the void with the worst scenarios. The sun was almost gone, painting the sky with fiery and grey tones, but the remaining light only accentuated the lion's white fur, transforming it into a mythical, almost ghostly figure. The shadows of the forest began to stretch, swallowing the familiar outlines of the trees and turning them into menacing silhouettes. With each passing second, reality became more surreal, more inescapable. Sophia felt the chill of the approaching night, but it was the cold of terror that froze her from within. Her mind, once so astute and calculating, was now a whirlwind of panic. She tried to think of an escape, a lie, an excuse, but the words dissolved before they could form. There was no negotiation with that creature, no bribery, no manipulation. There was only the naked truth of her actions, reflected in the lion's impenetrable eyes. The inheritance, the money, the luxurious life she coveted so much, all seemed like a cruel joke now, a distant phantom that had no place in that brutal reality. What mattered was survival, escape, anything to get away from that gaze that seemed to rip out her soul. Her mother, in turn, began to cough, a weak, hoarse sound that broke the tense silence. The lion, as if responding to the sound, turned its head slightly, its golden eyes fixed on the elderly woman for a longer moment. Sophia saw the scene, and a new kind of dread struck her. The lion had not attacked her yet, but kept her in psychological captivity, like a toy before the slaughter. What if it made her watch? What if her torment was prolonged, a slow and agonizing punishment? The elderly woman, with visible effort, raised a trembling hand, pointing at Sophia. There was no anger on her face, only deep sorrow, a pain that went beyond betrayal. It was the pain of a mother who saw her daughter's soul lost, corrupted. The lion followed the gesture with its gaze, and then slowly returned to fix its eyes on Sophia. It was as if the mother had confirmed the guilt, sealed the verdict. A low growl, a guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, escaped the lion's throat. It was not an attack roar, but a warning, a sound that vibrated in the air and in Sophia's very flesh. She felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, a tremor that mingled with her own. Her legs gave way and she slipped, falling to her knees in the damp earth, her hands sinking into the mud. Tears, which she had held back for so long, finally began to stream down, hot and bitter, mixing with the dirt on her face. She was broken, exposed, and the lion, majestic and relentless, watched her fall. There was no more dignity, no disguise. The villain, the manipulator, was now just a terrified woman, kneeling before her judge. The lion took another step, this time a little faster, and stopped a few inches from her. The warm, wild breath of the beast hit her face, and Sophia closed her eyes tightly, expecting the final blow, the end of everything. But the blow did not come. Instead, she felt something brush her shoulder, something rough and heavy. It was the lion's paw, not in an attack, but in a calculated touch, a pressure that prevented her from moving, from even breathing. What did it want? What would it do to her? The terror of the unknown was now her only companion, under the golden gaze of wild justice. The touch of the lion's paw on Sophia's shoulder was not the blow she expected, but a calculated, heavy pressure that pinned her to the damp ground. Her eyes, still tightly closed, tried to block out reality, but the wild scent of the beast, the warmth of its breath on her face, and the undeniable weight of the paw were sensations that pierced her denial. The world seemed to have shrunk to this point of contact, this imminent threat that did not materialize into an attack, but into a silent, prolonged torture. A low, deep growl reverberated in her chest, not of uncontrolled fury, but of unquestionable authority. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, an ancestral warning that forced her to open her eyes. Reluctantly, her eyelids lifted, revealing the world blurred by tears and terror. The first thing she saw was the lion's white fur, so close that each strand seemed like a crystal under the dying sunlight. Its golden eyes, now inches from hers, were pools of ancient wisdom and relentless judgment. There was no hatred in them, only a coldness that froze the soul. The paw on Sophia's shoulder did not move, but the pressure subtly increased, not to crush, but to guide. It was a force that prevented her from looking away, from escaping that brutal truth. The lion, with a slow and deliberate movement of its head, leaned slightly, and Sophia felt its rough muzzle brush her cheek. It was not a gesture of affection, but of imposition, of dominance. The terror intensified, a silent scream trapped in her throat. Then the paw moved, not to attack, but to push her. A firm, but not violent, push that made her stumble sideways, still on her knees. The lion did not release her, maintaining the pressure, forcing her to turn her body. Slowly, painfully, Sophia was forced to turn, her eyes fixing on what the beast wanted her to see. There she was, her mother, still in the wheelchair, pale, with disheveled white hair and wide eyes fixed on her. The image was a cruel mirror of her own cruelty. The woman she had tried to murder, now saved, and watching her being subjugated by a mythical creature. Shame, a feeling Sophia rarely felt, began to mix with dread, corroding her mask of indifference. The lion let out a guttural sound, almost a murmur, and the paw on her shoulder now propelled her forward. There was no choice. Sophia felt her legs numb and aching, but the lion's strength was undeniable. She began to crawl, stumbling on the damp earth towards her mother. Every inch was a humiliation, a forced confession of her crime. The lion followed closely, its imposing presence like a shadow, a silent guardian forcing her to face the consequences of her actions. Her mother did not say a word. Her lips trembled slightly, and a single tear rolled down her wrinkled face, but there was no accusation in her gaze, only a deep, almost unbearable sadness. It was the pain of a mother who saw her daughter's soul lost, not physically, but in spirit. For Sophia, that look was worse than any scream, any curse. It was the reflection of her own monstrosity. When Sophia was a few steps from the wheelchair, the lion stopped but maintained its position, blocking any attempt to escape. The paw on her shoulder withdrew, but the threat remained, hanging in the air. Sophia knelt before her mother, head bowed, unable to meet the gaze of the woman she had tried to kill. The silence was overwhelming, filled only by the distant murmur of the river and the frantic beating of her own heart. The lion then did something unexpected. With a smooth and precise movement of its head, it pushed Sophia's shoulder down, forcing her to bow even further, almost touching her forehead to the earth. It was a gesture of forced submission, a public humiliation before the victim of her cruelty. Sophia's tears flowed freely now, mixing with the mud, a bitter baptism of regret and despair. She smelled the crushed grass, the wet earth, and the subtle wild scent of the lion watching her. The inheritance, the luxury, the life she so craved, all seemed like a distant, meaningless mirage. At that moment, under the gaze of the beast and her mother, Sophia was merely a broken creature, stripped of her arrogance, confronted with the ugliness of her own soul. The lion did not roar again, nor did it attack. It simply remained there, a living statue of wild justice, observing the scene. Night advanced, and shadows deepened, swallowing the day's clarity and plunging the forest into a cloak of mystery. Sophia felt the night's cold penetrate her bones. But it was the cold of her own conscience that froze her from within. She had pushed her mother to death, and now knelt before her, forced to witness her own depravity. What more would the lion demand? What would be the final price of her cruelty? The wait was a torment that stretched to infinity under the golden gaze of the beast that refused to be just an animal. It was a judge, an executioner, and Sophia was in its court, without lawyers, without appeal, only the naked truth of her actions. Silence was a sharp blade, cutting through Sophia's sanity. Kneeling on the cold, damp earth, her forehead almost touching the ground, she felt the invisible weight of the lion's judgment and her mother's gaze, which was a mirror of her own depravity. Every fiber of her being screamed for escape, for denial, but there was nowhere to go, no way to lie. The smell of crushed grass, wet earth, and the lion's wild, penetrating scent filled her senses, trapping her in that moment of absolute humiliation. Night advanced, and with it, the shadows deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. The forest, once a scene of her impunity, now transformed into a dark and menacing prison. The cold of the night penetrated her bones, but it was the cold of her own conscience that froze her from within, an ice spreading from her chest to her extremities. She had pushed her mother to death and now knelt before her, forced to witness her own monstrosity. The lion, a living statue of wild justice, did not move. Its golden eyes, however, seemed to pierce the darkness, fixed on Sophia. The wait was a torment that stretched to infinity, under the gaze of the beast that refused to be just an animal. It was a judge, an executioner, and Sophia was in its court, without lawyers, without appeal, only the naked truth of her actions. What more would it demand? What would be the final price of her cruelty? Suddenly, a distant sound, a metallic click followed by a sharp creak, broke the oppressive silence. Sophia flinched, her muscles tense, and raised her head slightly, her red and swollen eyes trying to discern the source of the noise in the gloom. The lion let out a low growl, almost imperceptible, but one that vibrated in the earth and air, and then, With a slow and calculated movement, it stepped away from Sophia, turning towards the direction from which the sound had come. It was not an attack, but an invitation, a silent command. Sophia, still kneeling, felt a new wave of dread. The lion was not freeing her. It was guiding her to the next stage of her punishment. With trembling legs and an aching body, she crawled, following the beast with her gaze. Every movement of the lion was deliberate, every step laden with an intention Sophia could not comprehend, but which terrified her. The lion stopped a few meters away, its imposing silhouette against the twilight sky. Sophia, with immense effort, managed to stand, stumbling, her eyes fixed on the direction the lion seemed to indicate. And then she saw it. There it was, her car, the luxury SUV, which she had bought with the money she hoped to inherit. Her escape, her status symbol, was now an unrecognizable mass of twisted metal. The hood was crumpled like a crushed soda can, the windshield shattered into 1,000 fragments, and the doors, once so elegant, were bent inward, as if a gigantic force had squeezed them. It was a grotesque sight, a cruel parody of its former splendor. A choked scream escaped Sophia's throat. It was not just the shock of the material destruction, but the sudden and brutal understanding of her total and absolute trap. Her means of escape, her last vestige of control, had been pulverized. The lion had not only prevented her from fleeing, it had ensured she had nowhere to go. The forest, the river, the falling night, everything closed in around her, and her car, now useless scrap, was irrefutable proof of her condemnation. The lion turned its head, its golden eyes meeting Sophia's, and a deep growl, almost a whisper of triumph, escaped its throat. There was no doubt. It had done that. It had crushed her car, not out of blind rage, but with calculated precision, to seal her fate. Sophia felt her legs give way again, and she fell to her knees once more, her hands clutching the cold earth. Tears streamed freely, mixing with the dirt and despair. The lion watched her, its presence imposing, its white fur gleaming faintly in the growing darkness. It didn't need to speak. Its actions were eloquent, its justice implacable. Her mother, still in the wheelchair, watched the scene from afar, her face pale and her eyes tearful but without astonishment. It was as if she understood the nature of that judgment, the inevitability of retribution. The pain on her face was not for her daughter, but for the loss of Sophia's soul. The lion took a step forward, and Sophia closed her eyes, awaiting the end. But the end did not come in the form of an attack. Instead, she felt a soft yet firm touch on the back of her neck. It was not a paw, but the lion's rough muzzle, pushing her forward, away from the destroyed car, away from her last hope. The lion was leading her. To where? Into the depths of the forest. To the river that still murmured its song of death. The terror of the unknown was now her only companion, as the lion, her shadowy guardian, guided her to an uncertain fate under the cloak of night that swallowed the world. With each forced step, Sophia felt the loss of everything she valued and the certainty that her life, like her car, had been irremediably crushed. That touch on the nape of her neck was not an attack, but a condemnation. The lion's rough muzzle, soft and firm, pushed Sophia forward, away from the twisted carcass of her car, away from her mother, who watched her with a sadness that was a mirror of her soul. It was a touch that allowed no resistance, a silent command that forced her to stand, stumbling, and follow. To where? The question echoed in her mind, a mute cry of terror. The forest, once a refuge for her dark plans, now transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and fears. Night had swallowed the last remnants of light, and only the imposing silhouette of the lion, with its white fur almost ghostly in the darkness, served as a macabre guide. Every step was torture. Her legs, already aching and trembling, barely supported her. The damp, Cold earth clung to her bare feet, and branches and roots grabbed at her like invisible hands trying to stop her, or perhaps drag her into the abyss. The distant murmur of the river, which once seemed a death song, now mingled with the sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the croaking of frogs, the buzzing of insects. Every sound seemed amplified, transformed into a premonition, a warning. Sophia smelled the earth, the dense vegetation, and the wild, penetrating aroma of the lion, which followed her closely. Its presence a constant shadow, a relentless reminder that there was no escape. She stumbled, fell, and with each fall, the lion's muzzle pushed her again, without violence, but with unshakable determination. There was no time for rest, no room for pleas. It was a forced march, a pilgrimage of humiliation and despair. The tears which had once flowed freely now dried on her face, leaving streaks of dirt and salt. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was in an even greater torment. What did the lion want from her? What was the final destination of this macabre journey? Would it be a cliff where she would be forced to jump? A nest of hungry beasts? Or something even worse, something her distorted mind couldn't even conceive? The uncertainty was a sharp blade, cutting her sanity piece by piece. She looked back, hoping to see her mother, a last glimpse of humanity. But the darkness of the forest had already swallowed the image of the wheelchair and the woman's sad gaze. She was alone, completely at the mercy of the beast. Suddenly, the lion stopped. Sophia, who was following blindly, almost collided with its hind paw. The air grew heavy, and an oppressive silence fell over the forest, broken only by the sound of her own heart beating frantically in her chest. The lion turned its head, its golden eyes piercing the darkness, fixed on something ahead. Sophia, with bated breath, tried to discern what had stopped the beast. A few meters away, in a small, irregular clearing, something stood. It wasn't a tree, nor a rock. It was a structure, almost an improvised altar, made of rough stones and twisted branches, covered by low-lying vegetation that gave it an ancient, forgotten look. In the center, something gleamed faintly under the sparse moonlight filtering through the treetops. It was an object, but Sophia couldn't identify it. The lion let out a low growl, almost a murmur, and with a movement of its head, indicated that Sophia should approach. The dread intensified. This was not a place of physical punishment, but something more sinister, more ritualistic. With trembling legs, she dragged herself into the clearing, her eyes fixed on the gleaming object. As she approached, the moonlight revealed the truth, and a chill ran down her spine. It was no ordinary object. It was a small statuette, carved from dark wood, representing a female figure seated in a wheelchair. Beside her, a small lion figure with white fur painted seemed to protect her. It was a grotesque, almost childish representation, but undeniably her mother and the lion. And at the foot of the statuette, there was something else, a small mound of fresh earth, like a freshly dug grave. The air seemed to thin. The lion approached, and with a paw pushed Sophia to her knees before that improvised altar. Its golden eyes, now more intense than ever, seemed to demand understanding, acceptance from her. The statuette, the protective lion, the grave. The message was clear and brutal in its simplicity. It was a judgment not just of her actions, but of her soul. The lion would not kill her, not directly. It would force her to confront the death she had wished upon her mother and the life she had stolen from herself. What else would it demand from her at that altar of her own cruelty? The terror of the unknown was now her only companion, as the lion, her shadowy guardian, guided her to an uncertain fate under the cloak of night that swallowed the world. The air in the clearing became dense, heavy with the expectation and terror emanating from Sophia. The question echoed in her mind, a mute cry of despair. What else would it demand from her at that altar of her own cruelty? The lion, with its white fur almost phosphorescent in the darkness, was a silent sphinx, its golden eyes fixed on her, an implacable flame that seemed to burn her soul. Sophia felt the cold, damp earth under her knees, the smell of moss and decomposition mixed with the wild, clean scent of the beast. Every beat of her heart was a drum of condemnation, every breath a gasp of dread. She looked at the statuette, that grotesque yet undeniable representation of her mother and the lion. It was as if the universe through that majestic animal was mocking her plans, her arrogance. The figure of her mother in the wheelchair, protected by the small replica of the lion, was a cruel mirror of her failure, a vivid reminder that the life she had tried to extinguish had been saved. And now it was her own life that was at stake. And then her eyes shifted to the small mound of fresh earth, the freshly dug grave at the foot of the altar. There was no headstone, no name, just the darkness of the disturbed earth, a void that seemed to suck all light and hope. The lion let out a low growl, almost a murmur, that vibrated on the ground and ran up Sophia's spine. It was not a growl of anger, but of command, of unquestionable authority. With a slow and deliberate movement of its head, it indicated the grave. Sophia needed no words to understand. It wanted her to look. It wanted her to confront the abyss she had dug. With trembling hands, she leaned forward, her forehead almost touching the cold earth. Her eyes, clouded with tears and exhaustion, tried to penetrate the darkness of that hole. There was nothing there, just the damp darkness and the smell of earth. But the emptiness was more terrifying than anything that could have been hidden. It was the emptiness of her own morality, the vacuum left by the absence of love and compassion. The lion took another step, and Sophia felt the warmth of its breath on the back of her neck, a constant reminder of its overwhelming presence. It was not physically threatening her, not directly. The torture was psychological, a slow and agonizing dissection of her soul. It was forcing her to witness the funeral of her own humanity, the burial of her last chances for redemption. Suddenly, the lion moved its front paw, not to attack, but to push something towards Sophia. It was a small object that rolled across the earth until it stopped a few inches from her fingers. Sophia, with bated breath, extended a trembling hand and picked it up. It was a small medallion, made of darkened metal, with an engraving almost erased by time. She turned it in her palm, and under the faint moonlight she could discern the initials A.S. and M.S. intertwined. They were the initials of her parents, of a love she had forgotten, of a family she had shattered. The medallion was a ghost of the past, a reliquary of memories she had buried under layers of ambition and resentment. It was the symbol of the love her mother had shared with her father, the love Sophia had despised, exchanging it for material possessions and cold independence. The lion, with its piercing gaze, seemed to demand that she acknowledge what she had lost, what she had thrown away. With a new growl, the lion indicated the grave again. The message was clear, brutal in its simplicity. She should bury it. Bury the love, bury the memory, bury herself. It was a ritual of renunciation, a sacrifice imposed by a wild and ancestral justice. Tears streamed down again, hot and bitter, mixing with the dirt on her face. She clutched the medallion in her hand, feeling the cold metal against her skin. It was as if the weight of her entire life, of all her wrong choices, was concentrated in that small object. The lion watched her, motionless, waiting. There was no escape, no negotiation. This was her purgatory, and the lion, her silent executioner. With a sob that tore through the night silence, Sophia began to dig. Not with a shovel, but with her own fingernails, scratching at the damp, cold earth. Each handful of earth she removed was a piece of her soul detaching, each movement an act of humiliation and forced repentance. She didn't know what would come next, but the certainty that this ritual was only the beginning of her punishment consumed her. The lion, her shadowy guardian, guided her to an uncertain fate under the cloak of night that swallowed the world, and now, her very essence. Sophia's fingernails scraped against the damp, cold earth, each speck of dirt that lodged beneath them a fragment of the life she had tried to suffocate, of the love she was now being forced to bury. The medallion, clutched in her trembling hand, seemed to burn, an unbearable weight of memories and regrets. The initials AS and MS danced before her blurry eyes, the ghosts of her parents, of a happiness she had traded for cold, empty ambition. She smelled the earth, the moss, and decomposition, mixed with the wild, clean scent of the beast, which hung like an invisible threat. The lion watched her, motionless, a statue of ivory and gold in the forest's gloom. Its golden eyes did not blink, showed no anger, only an iron determination, an ancestral patience that seemed to have waited for this moment for ages. It was the guardian of that improvised purgatory, the silent judge of her corrupted soul, and Sophia felt the weight of its overwhelming presence, a burden that prevented her from breathing. The air was heavy, laden with the expectation of what would come next. With a sob that tore through the night's silence, Sophia finally released the medallion. It fell into the small grave, tapping softly against the disturbed earth. The sound, almost inaudible, echoed in her chest like a funeral bell, marking the end of an era, the burial of any trace of innocence that might still reside in her soul. With trembling hands, she began to push the earth back, covering the reliquary of a love she had despised, of a connection she had severed with her own family. Each handful of earth was a piece of her own humanity she was burying, each movement an act of humiliation and forced repentance, a silent confession of her sins. When the last particle of earth covered the medallion, Sophia collapsed onto herself, exhausted, broken, but the lion did not move. Its golden eyes, previously fixed on her with an almost painful intensity, now shifted to another point on the improvised altar, as if the previous scene was merely the prelude to an even greater torment. With a slow and calculated movement of its paw, it pushed something else closer to her, something that rolled across the earth until it stopped a few inches from her fingers. It was a small cloth doll, faded and worn, with one button eye missing, the fabric, once vibrant, now stained and frayed by time and use, a silent testament to years of affection. Sophia recognized it instantly, and an icy shock, deeper than any physical fear, ran down her spine. It was her mother's favorite doll, a gift from her father in the early years of their marriage, an object her mother kept with almost childlike affection, despite her age and its simple craftsmanship. The cloth doll was more than a toy. It was a symbol of lost innocence, of the tenderness Sophia had crushed under the weight of her cruelty and greed. It was the representation of a pure and selfless love, the kind of love she had denied her mother, trading it for material possessions and cold independence. The lion, with a low, guttural growl that vibrated on the ground and ran up Sophia's spine, indicated the doll and then the grave. The message was clear and even more brutal than the last. She would not only bury her parents' love, but also the innocence, the joy, the very essence of her mother's life that she had tried to destroy. A mute scream of horror formed in her throat, but no sound escaped, only a desperate gasp. Her eyes widened, fixed on the doll, then on the grave, then on the lion, begging for a truce, an understanding. It was too much. The physical pain of digging with her fingernails was insignificant compared to the agony of having to bury her mother's soul, piece by piece, under the cold, indifferent earth. The lion was not killing her, not directly. It was forcing her to dismember her own soul, to witness the death of everything good and pure in her past, to bury every trace of her own humanity. With each object, each forced burial, the understanding deepened, cruel and implacable. The lion sought not just punishment, but a brutal re-education, a rewriting of her history through pain, humiliation, and confrontation with the truth. It was forcing her to confront every layer of her cruelty, every betrayal, every act of contempt she had committed against the woman who gave her life. The forest, once a refuge of darkness for her crimes, was now a stage for her judgment, and the night, a silent and complicit witness to her fall and her torment. The lion took another step, and the ground trembled slightly under the impact of its paw, a sound that resonated like distant thunder in the oppressive silence. It leaned down, its muzzle almost touching the doll, and then, with a slow and deliberate movement, it pushed it into the grave before Sophia could even react. It was an act of finality, of an authority that admitted no questioning, a seal over another buried memory. And then it looked at Sophia, its golden eyes piercing her soul, and with a deeper, more menacing growl than any other, it indicated something else. It was not an object, it was a space. The lion, with its paw, dragged the earth beside the freshly closed grave, revealing an empty space, exactly the size for her. A shiver of pure and absolute terror ran through Sophia, paralyzing her. It didn't want her to bury more objects. It wanted her to bury herself, not literally perhaps, but symbolically. It wanted her to lie in the grave, to feel the cold of the earth, the darkness of the void, the death she had wished upon her mother, the death of her own soul. A shiver of pure and absolute terror ran through Sophia, paralyzing her. It was not an object. It was a space. The lion, with its paw, dragged the earth beside the freshly closed grave, revealing an empty space exactly the size for her. It didn't want her to bury more objects. It wanted her to bury herself. Not literally, perhaps, but symbolically. It wanted her to lie in the grave, to feel the cold of the earth, the darkness of the void, the death she had wished upon her mother, the death of her own soul. The air in her lungs seemed to freeze. Her body, previously exhausted, now trembled uncontrollably, not from fatigue, but from a terror so primitive that it reduced her to a helpless creature. Her eyes widened, fixed on the grave, then on the lion. A silent scream of denial formed in her throat, but the sound was stifled by the terror that suffocated her. It was too much. After burying the medallion, the doll, the symbols of her mother's love and innocence, now she was the next to be buried. The irony was cruel, the justice savage and relentless. The lion watched her, its golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to penetrate her very essence. There was no anger in its gaze, only a cold and unshakable determination. The patience of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. It did not roar, did not physically threaten her, but the message was clear, burned into her mind: obey, or the torment would be even greater. The forest, once a refuge of darkness for her crimes, was now a stage for her judgment, and the night, a silent and complicit witness to her fall and her torment. Sophia tried to move, but her muscles were stiff, paralyzed by fear. Her mind screamed in protest, in denial. She, Sophia, the woman who had built an empire of ambition and coldness, who had despised weakness and dependence, was now being forced to lie in a grave, to experience the death she had imposed. It was the ultimate humiliation, the annihilation of all her pride, of all her identity. With an effort that seemed to tear her soul, she began to drag herself. Every inch closer to the grave was a battle against her own instinct for survival, against the dignity she, ironically, still tried to preserve. Her hands, still dirty with earth and blood from her broken nails, trembled as she leaned on the edge of the disturbed earth. The smell of damp earth, of moss and decomposition, mixed with the wild, clean scent of the beast, invaded her nostrils, a macabre prelude to what was to come. She hesitated, looking into the dark void. It was a shallow hole, but deep enough to envelop her, to make her feel the weight of the earth upon her. The lion took a step forward, a slow and calculated movement that made the ground tremble slightly. The sound resonated like distant thunder in the oppressive silence of the night, a reminder that the time for hesitation was over. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, tried to discern what was above her. The night sky, sprinkled with indifferent stars, seemed even more distant, even more unattainable. The imposing silhouette of the lion rose above her, a shadowy and relentless guardian. It did not move, only watched her, as if expecting her to understand the depth of her punishment. And then the lion did something that made her hold her breath. With its front paw, it began to push the loose earth around the grave, not to cover her completely, but to create a sense of entrapment. Small clods of earth fell onto her body, onto her face, mixing with the tears that still streamed down. It was not a complete burial, but a simulation, a psychological torture that forced her to feel the weight of the earth, the claustrophobia, the helplessness. Each handful of earth that fell upon her was a reminder of her cruelty, her greed, her indifference. She felt the weight of her choices, the burden of her sins, now materialized in the cold earth that covered her. The smell of wet earth and moss invaded her nostrils, a constant reminder of her own mortality, of the fragility of the life she had tried to extinguish. Sophia lay there, motionless, feeling the cold of the earth and the weight of the world upon her. The lion, her silent executioner, watched her, its golden eyes piercing the darkness, demanding that she feel every ounce of pain, every drop of regret. She didn't know what would come next, but the certainty that this ritual was only the beginning of her punishment consumed her. The lion, her shadowy guardian, guided her to an uncertain fate, under the cloak of night that swallowed the world, and now her very essence. She was in purgatory, and the lion, her judge, showed no signs of mercy. The cold, damp earth penetrated Sophia, not just through her torn clothes, but into her very soul, chilling her to the bone. Each clod of earth the lion pushed over her was a weight, a materialized reminder of her sins. It wasn't a complete burial, not yet, but the simulation was so vivid, so cruel, that the line between life and death became thin, almost imperceptible. The smell of moss and decomposition, once just a forest aroma, was now the scent of her own grave, a macabre prelude to the end she had wished upon her mother. Her eyes, wide in the gloom, tried to adjust, but the darkness was more than the absence of light. It was the darkness of her own inner void, now reflected in the cramped space that enveloped her. The lion, its imposing and ghostly silhouette against the distant sky, continued its silent and methodical work. Every movement of its paw was deliberate. Every handful of earth that fell on Sophia was a blow, not to her body, but to her psyche, dismantling layer by layer the fortress of her arrogance and indifference. The weight of the earth on her chest was not just physical, it was the burden of her choices, the weight of the guilt she had ignored for so long. She felt claustrophobia tighten, the air thin, and a primitive panic began to set in. It wasn't death that frightened her as much as the sensation of death. The absolute helplessness, the annihilation of her will. She, who had always controlled, who had always manipulated, was now a puppet in the paws of a beast, forced to experience the death she had imposed. Silent tears streamed down her dirt-stained face, mixing with the grime and cold sweat. In her mind, flashes of memory projected, her mother's gentle smile, the soft touch of her hands, The words of love Sophia had despised, and then the vivid image of the push, the chair tumbling into the current, the look of betrayal and despair in her mother's eyes. The indifference she had felt at that moment was now replaced by a visceral terror, an agony that consumed every fiber of her being. The lion was not killing her, it was forcing her to live death, to feel every ounce of the pain she had inflicted. Time distorted. Minutes seemed like hours, hours seemed like an eternity. The lion, with its infinite patience, continued to push the earth, covering her up to her neck. Only her head remained exposed, her eyes fixed on the beast, pleading for an end that did not come. The cold intensified, the dampness penetrated, and the feeling of being trapped, immobilized, was overwhelming. She couldn't move a muscle, only breathe shallowly, each inhalation an effort, each exhalation a muffled groan. The surrounding forest seemed to conspire against her. The rustling of leaves in the wind sounded like whispers of condemnation, the distant croaking of a frog, a lament for her lost soul. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast ghostly shadows, transforming the trees into silent sentinels of her torment. Sophia was at the bottom of her own personal hell, and the lion was her guide, her executioner, her judge. When the earth finally stopped falling, Sophia was almost completely buried. Only her head, covered in dirt and tears, remained visible. The lion stepped back, its golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to burn her soul. There was no anger in its gaze, only a cold and unshakable determination. The patience of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. It watched her, as if expecting her to understand the depth of her punishment, the irony of her fate. Then, the lion did something unexpected. It lowered its head, its muzzle almost touching the earth beside Sophia's head. With a low growl, almost a grunt, it began to drag the earth away from her, revealing one of her hands, then her arm, and slowly the rest of her body. It was not an act of mercy, but a new kind of torment. It was forcing her to feel the inverse process, to emerge from death, but not by her own will. With each handful of earth the lion removed, Sophia felt a momentary relief, quickly replaced by a new wave of panic. She was being resurrected, but not by choice. It was a forced resurrection, a return to a life she did not deserve, a chance to continue her judgment. The cold of the earth still enveloped her, but now the air felt freer, though still heavy with the scent of her humiliation. When she was finally free of the earth, though still covered in it, Sophia tried to stand, but her muscles were stiff, her limbs numb. She fell back into the shallow grave, exhausted, broken. The lion watched her, its golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. It did not help her, it waited. The message was clear, the struggle for life was hers, and she would have to crawl out of that hole alone. With an effort that seemed to tear her soul, Sophia began to drag herself. Her hands, still dirty with earth and blood from her broken nails, clutched the edge of the grave, pulling her heavy, aching body. Every inch was a battle, a reminder of the ease with which she had pushed her mother to death, and the difficulty with which she now fought for her own existence. Finally, with a groan of exhaustion, she managed to pull herself out of the grave, collapsing face down on the cold earth. She was free of the earth, but not of the lion. It approached, its steps slow and heavy, and stopped a few meters from her. Its golden eyes, previously fixed on the grave, now turned to the dark forest. With a movement of its head, it indicated a path, an almost invisible trail between the dense trees. It was not an invitation, but a command. The purgatory had not ended. It had merely changed scenery. The lion, her shadowy guardian, guided her to an uncertain fate, under the cloak of night that swallowed the world, and now her very essence. The cold, damp earth clung to Sophia, a second skin of humiliation and fear. Every fiber of her body screamed in protest, her muscles rigid from the tension and effort of crawling out of that simulated grave. The air she breathed, once a breath of relief for no longer being buried, now felt heavy, dense with the smell of moss, earth, and the wild scent of the lion. Her eyes, swollen and burning, fixed on the imposing silhouette of the beast, which, with a nod of its head, pointed into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. It was not an invitation, but a silent command, a decree. The purgatory had not ended, it had merely changed scenery. With an inaudible groan, Sophia tried to stand. Her legs, numb and weak, gave way beneath her weight, and she fell to her knees, her hands digging into the soft earth. The pain was excruciating, but the lion's silent threat was an invisible whip, propelling her forward. She crawled, using her hands and knees, until she managed to steady herself, stumbling. Every step was agony, her bare and wounded feet encountering sharp branches and stones. The forest, once a distant backdrop to her cruelty, now became a labyrinth of shadows and dangers, where every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed like an omen. The lion moved, not ahead, but beside her, a shadowy and relentless guardian. Its steps were slow, measured, ensuring that Sophia did not stray, did not try to escape. She felt the beast's golden gaze upon her, an invisible weight that prevented her from looking away for too long from the dimly lit path. The darkness was almost total, broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees, creating ghostly patterns on the forest floor. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the heavy footsteps of the lion. Sophia felt her heart pounding in her chest, a frantic drum of fear and exhaustion. Her mind, once so full of plans and manipulations, was now empty of everything except primordial terror. She did not know where she was being led, nor what awaited her, and this uncertainty was an even greater torment than the physical pain. Every tree seemed like a sentinel, every shadow a threat. As she advanced, images of her mother, of the brutal push, of the chair tumbling into the current, returned with painful clarity. The indifference she had felt at that moment was now replaced by overwhelming guilt, a poison spreading through her veins. The lion was not just physically punishing her, it was forcing her to confront the darkness of her own soul, to relive every act of cruelty. It was psychological torture, a walking purgatory. The trail became steeper, the terrain more uneven. Sophia stumbled, falling to her knees again, her hands scratched and bleeding. The metallic taste of blood mixed with the taste of earth in her mouth. She looked at the lion, expecting a reaction, perhaps a growl of impatience, but it merely watched her, its golden eyes fixed on her, without a hint of emotion. It was as if it knew she would get up, that she had no choice. With superhuman effort, she rose again, every muscle protesting. With each step, she felt the night's cold penetrate her torn clothes, the icy wind whispering dark secrets among the trees. Exhaustion consumed her, but fear was a more potent engine, driving her forward. She could not stop, could not give up. The lion would not allow it. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees becoming denser, the darkness deeper. Sophia felt her throat dry, her mouth pasty, but there was no water, only the dampness of the forest and the smell of decomposition. Hunger and thirst were secondary to the terror that dominated her. Suddenly, the lion stopped. Sophia, who was following closely, almost collided with its hind paw. She looked up, her heart pounding erratically. Ahead, the darkness seemed to deepen, but there was a clearing, an open space where the moonlight, now stronger, revealed a scene that made Sophia's blood run cold. In the center of the clearing, there was an ancient structure, almost in ruins, covered in moss and ivy. It seemed to be a small stone hut, or perhaps an old shelter, but what truly caught her attention was what lay before it. A campfire, already lit, crackled softly, casting dancing shadows in the clearing. And beside the campfire, seated in an improvised wheelchair made of branches and vines, was her mother. The shock was so intense that Sophia felt the air leave her lungs. Her mother was alive, not just alive, but sitting there looking at the fire with a serenity that violently contrasted with the torment Sophia had just endured. The lion, with a low growl, pushed Sophia forward, forcing her to approach. Sophia's mother, with white hair framing a face marked by life, but now illuminated by the soft firelight, raised her eyes and met her daughter's gaze. There was no anger, no condemnation, only deep sadness and a weariness that seemed millennia old. Sophia, covered in dirt, exhausted and broken, stumbled until she stopped a few meters from the campfire. The lion positioned itself between them, a silent guardian, ensuring Sophia could neither touch her mother nor flee. The warmth of the campfire, previously inviting, now seemed to burn Sophia's skin, a reminder of her own hell. She looked at her mother, at the improvised wheelchair, and at the lion that separated them. The scene was a cruel mirror of her crime, a perverse inversion of roles. She, the tormentor, was now the prisoner, and her victim, the witness to her punishment. The lion, her judge, had orchestrated the reunion, not for reconciliation, but for the final confrontation, so that Sophia could see, with her own eyes, the life she had tried to extinguish and the justice that had reached her. The night was still long, and the true judgment was just beginning. The air in the clearing was heavy, dense with the smell of smoke, damp earth, and the terror emanating from Sophia. Her eyes, previously fixed on the imposing silhouette of the lion, were now paralyzed by the sight before her, her mother, alive, sitting there by a crackling campfire in an improvised wheelchair that looked more like a rustic throne carved by nature itself. The shock was a physical blow, emptying her lungs, stealing her voice. Every fiber of her being screamed in disbelief, in panic, in a guilt that until then she had managed to suppress. The dancing firelight illuminated her mother's face, revealing deep wrinkles, snow-white hair, but also a serenity that was almost unbearable for Sophia. There was no anger in the woman's eyes, nor the fury Sophia expected, which she perhaps even deserved. There was only a deep sadness, a weariness that seemed to have spanned centuries, and a quietness that spoke louder than any scream. It was the quietness of someone who had endured the unbearable, who had been betrayed by her own flesh, and who, somehow, had found a bitter peace amidst the desolation. Sophia stumbled, her body covered in dirt and wounds, a grotesque contrast to the almost ethereal image of her mother. The lion, with a low growl that vibrated on the ground, gently pushed her forward, forcing her to close the distance between them. Every step was torture, a walk towards her own particular hell. The heat of the campfire, which should have been a comfort in the cold night, burned Sophia's skin, as if each flame were an accusing finger. She stopped a few meters from the campfire, the lion positioning itself between her and her mother, a silent guardian, an insurmountable barrier. Sophia tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice caught in a knot of terror and shame. Words seemed useless, empty before the magnitude of her crime and the living presence of her victim. Her mother, in turn, said nothing. She merely watched her, her eyes fixed on Sophia's, as if reading every thought, every forced regret, every lingering trace of cruelty that might still inhabit that broken soul. The scene was a cruel inversion, a distorted mirror of her heinous act. She, the tormentor, was now the prisoner, the judged. Her mother, the victim, was the witness, the personification of the justice that had reached her. The improvised wheelchair, made of branches and vines, was a vivid reminder of the fragility Sophia had exploited and the resilience she had underestimated. The lion, the relentless judge, had orchestrated this reunion, not for reconciliation, but for the final confrontation, so that Sophia could see, with her own eyes, the life she had tried to extinguish and the truth that had condemned her. The ruined stone hut in the background, covered in moss and ivy, seemed like a relic from a forgotten time, a perfect setting for this primordial judgment. The smell of earth, forest, and smoke enveloped everything, creating a dense and oppressive atmosphere. Sophia felt the weight of her mother's gaze, a burden heavier than any chain, more painful than any physical wound. She wanted to look away, wanted to flee, but the lion would not allow it. Its golden eyes gleamed in the darkness, a silent promise that there would be no escape. Sophia's mind, once so astute and calculating, was now a whirlwind of fragmented images. The push, the chair tumbling, the current dragging her mother's fragile body. Each memory was a stab, amplified by the living presence of the woman she had condemned to death. The indifference she had felt at that moment had transformed into overwhelming remorse, a poison spreading through her veins, corroding her from within. She had thought her mother's death would be the end of her problems, the beginning of her freedom. Instead, it had been the beginning of her own hell. The silence between them was deafening, filled only by the crackling of the campfire and the sound of Sophia's ragged breathing. Her mother, with a slow and deliberate movement, extended one hand towards the fire, as if seeking warmth, or perhaps as if offering a silent prayer. Her fingers, thin and marked by time, seemed fragile, but there was an inherent strength in every gesture. Sophia watched, fascinated and terrified. The image of her mother, the woman she had tried to erase from existence, now there, a beacon of resilience amidst the darkness. The lion, with an almost imperceptible movement of its head, indicated to Sophia that she should sit. There were no chairs for her, only the cold, damp earth. With an inaudible groan she obeyed, bending her knees and falling heavily to the ground, a few meters from her mother. The humiliation was complete. She, who had always sought comfort and luxury, was now there, dirty, wounded, helpless, before the woman she had tried to destroy. The night was still long, and the true judgment was just beginning. The reunion was not an end, but a prelude, a new phase of the purgatory orchestrated by the lion. Sophia knew, with a cold certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the punishment would not be merely physical. It would be a torture of the soul, a confrontation with each of her demons under her mother's silent gaze and the albino beast's relentless vigilance. The dark forest seemed to close in on the clearing, and Sophia felt herself swallowed by the very darkness she had cultivated in her heart. She was trapped, not just by the lion's presence, but by the web of her own actions, and there was no escape. The cold, damp ground of the clearing was a bed of thorns for Sophia. Every muscle protested, every wound throbbed, but the physical pain was a mere whisper compared to the silent scream of her soul. She was there, prostrate, before the woman she had tried to murder, under the relentless gaze of the lion that had rescued her. Humiliation was a heavy cloak, suffocating her, and the silence between them was more deafening than any storm. Sophia's mother, seated on her rustic throne of branches and vines, seemed like a statue carved by pain and resilience. Her eyes, once filled with a millennial sadness, now seemed to penetrate Sophia's very essence, stripping bare every lie, every cruelty. There was no anger, no explicit condemnation, only a quietness that screamed truths Sophia had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. It was the gaze of someone who had seen the abyss and returned, not with fury, but with a deep understanding of human nature, including its most intimate darkness. Sophia tried to look away, but it was useless. Her mother's eyes were anchors, binding her to the reality of her crime. Sophia's mind was a battlefield. Fragmented images of her past, of her unchecked ambition, of her cold indifference to her mother's fragility danced before her eyes. She saw herself pushing the chair, the murky water swallowing the fragile figure, the perverse sense of relief that had overcome her in that moment. Now, that relief had transformed into a corrosive poison, burning her from within. The lion, a silent guardian, maintained its position between them. Its golden eyes, previously merely menacing, now seemed to carry the weight of an ancestral wisdom, of a judgment that transcended human laws. It did not need to speak. Its presence was the law itself, justice incarnate. With each crackle of the campfire, Sophia felt the warmth, but not comfort. It was a warmth that reminded her of the fires of hell she had lit for herself. Hours dragged on, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had distorted into a personal purgatory. Sophia felt the night's cold penetrate her torn clothes, the dampness of the earth clinging to her skin. Hunger and thirst, once urgent, were now mere annoyances compared to the psychological torture that consumed her. She expected a scream, an accusation, a plea for forgiveness that she didn't know if she could utter. But the silence persisted, more potent than any words. Suddenly, Sophia's mother made a movement. Slow, deliberate, she extended a hand towards the campfire, her fingers thin and marked by time, almost touching the dancing flames. Sophia watched, paralyzed. It was a gesture of seeking warmth, or perhaps a silent offering, a prayer. But for Sophia, it seemed a cruel reminder of the life she had tried to extinguish. Now there, so close to the fire, so full of a resilience she had never imagined. Then, the voice. Low, hoarse from time and ordeal, but clear as the purest bell. Sophia's mother spoke, not to her directly, but to the air, to the flames, to the forest that surrounded them. I saw the darkness in your eyes, Sophia. I saw it long before you pushed me. I saw when ambition became a monster, devouring the goodness that once existed within you. Her mother's voice was a whisper, but each word struck Sophia like a physical blow. She flinched, her eyes wide with terror and shock. Her mother was not furious. She was simply stating a bitter truth, a truth Sophia had buried under layers of denial. I didn't want you to live like this, her mother continued, her voice choked with deep sadness, not for herself, but for her daughter. I didn't want wealth to be your god, nor power your only pursuit. I just wanted you to be happy, Sophia, truly happy. Her mother's words were like knives, cutting through Sophia's defenses, exposing the festering wound of her own soul. She had believed that happiness lay in what she could buy, in the control she could exert. But now, sitting on the cold ground, dirty and broken, she realized the farce. She had never been happy, only empty. The lion, with a low, guttural growl, moved slightly, its eyes fixed on Sophia. It was not a growl of threat, but of confirmation, as if endorsing every word of her mother. It was a reminder that the truth, however painful, could not be denied. Sophia's mother slowly turned her face, her eyes meeting her daughter's again. This time a tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek, a single drop that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of disillusionment. You took everything from me, Sophia, she said, her voice a little stronger now, but still permeated with sadness. My home, my dignity, almost my life. But you did not take my soul, and you will not take yours if you allow the truth to set you free. Sophia felt a sob rise in her throat, a cry she had repressed for years, for decades. Her mother's words, so devoid of hatred, were more devastating than any curse. They confronted her with the monstrosity of her actions, not through anger, but through the love and pain she had caused. The judgment was not a death sentence, but a life sentence, a life she would have to face with the truth of who she really was. The night was still long, and Sophia's purging was just beginning. The sob that rose in Sophia's throat was not a human sound. It was a primal lament, a muffled cry from a soul in agony, breaking the oppressive silence of the clearing. Tears, previously held back by a fortress of pride and denial, gushed uncontrollably, washing the dirt from her face, but unable to purify the stain on her heart. She hunched further on the cold ground, her shoulders trembling violently, her body convulsing under the weight of a truth she had avoided her entire life. Her mother's words, devoid of hatred, yet laden with such profound pain, had been the final blade, severing the last ties of her self-defense. Sophia wept not only for the act of cruelty she had committed, but for an entire existence of wrong choices, of an emptiness she had tried to fill with material possessions and illusory power. She wept for the girl she once was, before ambition transformed her into a monster. She wept for the mother she had lost, not just in the current, but long before, when her heart closed to love. Sophia's mother, seated in her rustic chair, watched her daughter with an expression that mingled sadness and a strange serenity. There was no triumph in her eyes, only the confirmation of a painful prophecy. She did not move to console Sophia, nor to reprimand her. Her presence in itself was the mirror reflecting her daughter's shattered soul. Her thin, marked fingers still hovered near the flames, as if the fire's warmth was the only silent witness to her own suffering. The albino lion, the guardian of that primordial judgment, remained motionless. Its golden eyes, previously menacing, now seemed observant, almost curious, as if witnessing a natural phenomenon, the implosion of a soul. Its low growl, which had previously validated her mother's words, now seemed a murmur of the forest itself, an echo of the truth unfolding. It was nature, relentless and just, demanding the balance Sophia had disturbed. Sophia's mind was a whirlwind of memories, no longer fragmented, but vivid and cruel. She saw herself, young and full of promise, gradually transforming into the cold, calculating woman who had pushed her own mother to death. She saw the moments when she chose money over family, power over compassion. Each memory was a new stab, each tear a river of regret. The indifference that had consumed her for so long was now replaced by excruciating pain, a pain she deserved, but which seemed unbearable. "You thought you would silence me." Sophia's mother's voice broke the silence again, stronger now, but still tinged with melancholy. "That the current would erase my existence, and with it, your conscience. But life, Sophia, has ways of confronting us with what we try to hide, and the truth, like water, always finds its way." Sophia looked up, her eyes swollen and red, fixing on her mother. A silent plea hung in the air. And now, what did one do after confronting one's own monstrosity? How did one live with the truth of having tried to murder one's own mother? "There are no shortcuts to peace, Sophia," her mother continued, her thin fingers tracing invisible patterns in the cold air. "There is no way to buy forgiveness, nor to escape the consequences. What you did, that will stay with you, but what you will do with it, that is your true choice." The lion raised its head, its eyes fixed on her mother, as if attentive to every word, a guardian of the forest's morality. It was the personification of natural law, the balance that weighed actions and intentions. Sophia's crumpled car out there in the darkness was physical proof that escape was not an option, that the judgment would be complete. Sophia's mother, with visible effort, extended her hand towards her daughter. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of invitation. "The darkness you saw in me, Sophia, was merely a reflection of your own, but the light, the true light, is within you too. Buried perhaps under layers of pain and error, but still there." Sophia hesitated. To reach back meant accepting vulnerability, humiliation, responsibility. It meant stripping herself of all the pride that had defined her for so long. But the alternative was to remain in the darkness, alone, with the shadow of her actions as her only companion. With a tremor that ran through her entire body, Sophia dragged herself a few inches, extending her own hand, dirty with earth and tears. Her fingers touched her mother's, an electric contact that seemed to seal a silent pact. It was not instant forgiveness, but the beginning of a path, a mutual acceptance that the journey, for both of them, was far from over. The lion, as if sensing the change in the atmosphere, let out a low growl, almost a purr. It stood up, its eyes sweeping the clearing, and then, with a fluid and powerful movement, turned and walked into the darkness of the forest, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. Its mission was accomplished. The truth had been revealed. The judgment initiated. The campfire, which had previously seemed a beacon of warmth and safety, now diminished, its flames dancing weaker, as if the intensity of the moment had drained away with the lion's departure. The cold of dawn began to intensify, and the smell of dew mingled with the aroma of smoke. Sophia and her mother remained there, their hands still joined, in the twilight preceding dawn. There were no words, only the heavy silence of understanding. Sophia knew that the path ahead would be long and arduous, filled with regret and the need to rebuild, not just her life, but her very soul. She had hit rock bottom, and now, with her mother's hand as a fragile anchor, she would have to start climbing. Stone by stone, tear by tear, she would face the ruins of her own existence, seeking the redemption that truth, however painful, finally offered her. The sun had not yet risen, but a new dawn for Sophia was just beginning to break.